Consequences, real and lasting consequences, are pretty rare in British politics, but the long-deserved and long-anticipated fall of Peter Mandelson, a story which has dominated the political news, does look like someone actually getting at least a fraction of the comeuppance that he so richly deserves. You will, of course, doubtless be familiar with the context. The US government released a vast new tranche of files, 3 million or so of them, relating to Jeffrey Epstein, the financier, paedophile, abuser and sex trafficker. Much of that archive is still yet to really be examined in great detail, and there is more yet unseen. But what it reveals very clearly is a vast, squalid and sordid influence network in which wealthy and powerful men pathetically attempt to ingratiate themselves before Epstein's vast wealth, find ways to advance their private agendas, and gratify themselves with coerced and trafficked women and girls. Peter Mandelson was close to Epstein, and it was a relationship that persisted while he was Lord President of the Council and First Secretary of State in Gordon Brown's government, that is, de facto Deputy Prime Minister. And he persisted in that friendship even after Epstein's conviction and imprisonment for procuring a minor, a child, for prostitution. Mandelson seeks Epstein's advice over many things, including property deals and cash for his partner, as well as how to make serious money after leaving government. Those exchanges are squalid, they're off-colour, they're ingratiating, and they're dazzled, really, really dazzled by Epstein's wealth. They are concerned entirely with self-advancement and entirely soaked with the desire for it. And there's a lot to be angry about in these emails, and we're going to talk about just some of it, but I wanted to highlight one thing here at the top of the episode. In the immediate wake of the financial crisis, Peter Mandelson is passing confidential advice given to the Prime Minister, information to which he was privy because he was, supposedly, acting as a servant of the people of this country. He's passing that information to his paedophile banker friend with the express purpose of weakening and undermining any regulation or constraint which might be imposed on the banks as a result of the financial crisis. The financial crisis was not an abstract phenomenon. It was not a question of numbers dancing around on a balance sheet. Real people lost their jobs. They lost the roof over their head. Countless lives were blighted. Many countries, including our own, the UK, were permanently altered as a result and still live with its consequences. What was Peter's response to all this? It was to run to the protection of concentrated wealth and power, the very people who caused the crisis itself. It was, fundamentally, to betray the people of this country and to go on betraying them again and again and again, and to complain wretchedly that he was prohibited from cashing in on his European expertise. That is the measure of the man, and that is the measure of his beliefs. So consequences there are. Mandelson is out. Morgan McSweeney, the Prime Minister's chief advisor and close associate of Peter Mandelson, who pushed for him to take the role as ambassador to the United States, is gone. Starmer, for now, survives, although difficult questions remain about why he was appointed in the first place, and exactly who chose to ignore or circumvent the vetting which must have raised alarms about his association with Epstein. Meanwhile, the very same journalists who welcomed the Mandelson appointment as a stroke of tactical genius, the very same who love to invite the Prince of Darkness onto their shows as a representative of amoral, Machiavellian dark genius, who wanted a little squalid thrill from proximity to his ruthlessness, are now shocked and horrified to learn that he might, in fact, not be a very good person. So Mandelson is gone. But does Mandelsonism remain? How did this poison worm its way to the heart of the Labour Party and to the heart of the British political establishment? How did the networks of power represented by Mandelson and Epstein really function? And are we getting a glimpse of the real world of power in action and what yet remains still in its shadows? I'm James Butler, and you're listening to On Politics, a podcast series from the London Review of Books, and I'm joined this week by two investigative journalists who are adept at turning over political rocks and seeing what dark creatures lurk underneath them. Peter Geoghegan, who heads up the investigative site Democracy for Sale, which made headlines this week revealing Labour politicians paying to investigate journalists and pursue their sources, and Ethan Shone, investigations reporter at Open Democracy, where he's tracked the influence operations of tech and big business, including, of course, Peter Thiel's Palantir, an organisation we will doubtless talk about today. Peter, Ethan, welcome.
Thank you very much for having us, James.
Thanks, it's a pleasure.
And perhaps I'll begin, Peter, by asking you, what did I miss out in that account, or what are the features of this story that have perhaps surprised or really struck you, and what's core to it in your reading?
I think you nailed the most important point of this, which I think is we can see in a way that I think actually really has been quite remarkable. I think even for people who knew Mandelson well, that while he was the business secretary in 2009 under Gordon Brown, in the midst of the financial crisis, he was a Democratic representative. He was actually in the House of Lords, which is how we were able to shuffle people into, it's part of a little asterisk there. He's a Democratic representative for our government, supposedly working for the people of Britain. And at the same time, he was ferrying incredibly important, incredibly sensitive information to Jeffrey Epstein. The kind of things like we saw, I think the thing that really probably jumped out at me and lots of other people was the suggestion he made to Epstein that Jamie Dimon, the chief executive of the US banking giant JP Morgan, should mildly threaten Alistair Darling over those bank bonuses, as you mentioned. And we'll go on to talk about this, I'm sure, but it's worth another asterisk, which is that JP Morgan went on to become a client of Global Counsel, Peter Mandelson's lobbying firm. We will talk about that in time. But I think what comes out from this, or what I took from this actually in some ways, is you can see the scandals of Mandelson's early career, and it's worth very quickly running through one or two of them. He had to resign a number of times. He was involved. He took money from Jeffrey Robinson a year into in 1998. There's the passport affair with the Hinduja brothers, his relationship with Oleg Deripaska, this Russian oligarch. So there's a lot of stuff there before. But what I felt like is this coloured in a huge, huge swathe that I think a lot of us, we're not aware of. And even I, who can be cynical at times about this, doing the work I do, could not believe the level of detail that he was passing on to Jeffrey Epstein. Right down to, and it's not a market sensitive, but actually it is market sensitive too, we've finally got rid of Gordon Brown. He's finally gone. And on the day Gordon Brown resigned, before Gordon Brown resigned. So Jeffrey Epstein, who at this stage is a convicted paedophile, knew that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Gordon Brown, a very, very significant moment, because he could have formed a coalition with the Lib Dems, it was possible, was gone, had been pushed out. And he knew that before almost anybody else.
Ethan, how about you? What has struck you about this story as it's come to light?
Yeah, I think between you've covered it all very well. I think maybe this is a kind of a journalist's kind of fascination, but I am always intrigued by what we learn about the media when scandals like this occur, and I suppose that the relationships that you mentioned there, James, between many of the people who were and are, well, certainly were friendly with Peter Mandelson, and were very keen to have him on their shows, and were very keen to utilise his understanding of the shape of the Labour Party and his network across it to further their own reporting careers. I was struck. I was having conversations with some colleagues in the lobby last week who were trying to, I suppose, take seriously this line that Starmer didn't know the extent of the relationship between Mandelson and Epstein until fairly recently, until this most recent kind of tranche, or certainly the documents that came out in September when Mandelson was actually sacked. And perhaps I shouldn't admit to this, but I'm not an especially well-connected journalist. I'm not especially plugged in to the world of Westminster. And I would say that if I knew, based on publicly available documents, then they knew, and certainly the people around Keir Starmer knew. But I suppose what I wondered when I was speaking to people in the lobby about this is, if they didn't know, perhaps that should prompt the question of why they didn't. And perhaps it's because they didn't want to know, because there are questions here about access. I don't envy some colleagues in the lobby who do more day-to-day reporting than perhaps kind of Peter and I do, and are perhaps more reliant on the kind of relationships that facilitate that. When as a kind of muckraker, I don't have to worry about that kind of thing. So I think there is a moment for journalists to kind of ask the questions about how we handle relationships with sources who we know to be, at the very least, kind of questionable.
I mean, I think that's right. And one of the things that has struck me just over the last couple of days is one of the very few people who has done a little bit of reflection about that is Lewis Goodall, who has, of course, been on this show before, and who was saying, in his interview with Mandelson, he thought about pursuing the FT's line. I mean, it's worth saying to audiences who don't know, the FT the Financial Times has played a big role in pursuing this story. And in particular, when it put it to him, I think about a year ago, he dismissed it all as he told them to fuck off and that it was a Financial Times obsession, which is looking like a little bit of a rather nettled response now in retrospect. But what's striking about Goodall's sort of self-examination is his recognition that Mandelson was litigious, that he was happy to use the legal processes to protect himself from that kind of inquiry, and that the trade-off from raising this question with him would probably be that he wouldn't get another interview with him, that as he took up his post as US ambassador, that pursuing that story would be deleterious to his job. He admits, I think quite freely, that their assessment of how significant that story was at the time was simply wrong. But that's an assessment that was shared widely by the British media. Perhaps it is worth just saying here, or asking both of you, the question of lawfare here, and the question of sort of the strategic use of law, and Britain in particular. It crops up in the Epstein emails, of course. He mentions at various points that Britain is the ideal place to pursue legal redress or the frankly the chilling of investigation. Peter, I'm going to ask you about that because it's something that I know that you have a bit of experience in. This is a big problem in Britain.
James, it's quite remarkable. I'd literally just written down lawfare on my notebook as you spoke. So we're definitely in symbiosis here. And it was something that struck me. I actually posted in Blue Sky on I think maybe it was a Sunday night as I started to go through, like everybody else, in a very analog way, the Epstein files. One of the things that jumped out at me was this continuous reference to law firms. People Mandelson knew at senior law firms that we all know, actually law firms who've sued me in the past. So I am very, very, very familiar with this, what we call SLAPs, strategic litigation against public participation. But effectively, London is the libel capital of the world. And Mandelson himself was basically helping to advise Epstein about how to shut things down in London, how to use London lawyers. And you mentioned the FT's excellent reporting. Back in September, Jim Pickard at the FT, and I think it was Peter Foster as well, two really good reporters at the FT, they had the story that Epstein had given money to Ronaldo, Peter Mandelson's partner, for what quite incredulously was a fellowship, an osteopathy fellowship, I think was what it was described. So money for Ronaldo to do an osteopath course. And they went to a quote-unquote source very close to Peter Mandelson, which, I don't know who their source was, but that really does mean, often that means the person himself or someone really, the person who's sitting next to them. This is often very, very close. And they put it to this person and they said, no, that's completely untrue. And there was threats, if you print this, we will have to sue you because it's defamatory. So even at that stage, the way in which the courts in the UK are used is absolutely, it's incredible chilling effect. And it stopped a lot of the reporting. A lot of the stories that we've come out of these Epstein files would have been almost impossible to tell in another way. So, for example, that osteopath story, they had a source who told them this, they didn't have the documents. So they had to go and they fronted up Mandelson, which is a very common journalistic trait. And sometimes someone might say no comment, and that puts you in a difficult position as a journalist because, what do? You've only got one source. But to go and lie, to say this never happened, to lie, and that shows that the pervasiveness of this. And we have, when it comes to lawfare in this country, there's supposed to be regulation. The last government said they were going to bring in regulation after, literally the day after, or a couple of days after. I wrote about this for the paper, for the LRB, actually, I think back in 2023, that they were going to bring in legislation after the Ukraine invasion. There was some legislation brought in very weak. Keir Starmer said he was going to bring legislation. That hasn't happened. And effectively what you have is it's still open season. And if you're a journalist, even if you're telling the truth, the very act of being sued, if you end up if you're fighting a case, you'll end up in the High Court. That's a minimum of £3 million. It can easily stretch to 10, 15 million. And the way in which that system has been set up. It benefits massively a handful of incredibly rich law firms. And we can see in the Epstein files this incredible evidence, which you often don't often get, of people actively talking about, I'm going to use these lawyers just to shut this down.
I mean, that's one of the features of this correspondence or these files that really struck me, is that you're getting a sort of unvarnished view of the conversations that these people have. Incidentally, in the clear. I mean, these aren't encrypted emails. These are emails that they send to each other. I think about the precautions that people in politics sometimes take to ensure that things aren't written down, to ensure that the conversations happen either on the phone or in person or whatever. And yet, I mean, these things are just out there in the clear.
One thing I think, James, about this, and I think we might go on to talk about this a little more, is this gives us this incredible network, this incredible bird's eye view of how this whole thing operated. It's remarkable. But it also happened at a specific moment where emails were used pervasively. Like the amount of emails Jeffrey Epstein was sending are incredible. They're off the scale in terms of volume. But nowadays, so it's before paper, it's after paper. So back in the day, no one would have written this many. They would have maybe had a phone call. They would never have written this many letters. But nowadays, these conversations are happening, but they're not happening on email. They're happening on WhatsApp. They're happening maybe on Signal. And they're almost all happening with disappearing messages. So unless someone on a call has an express desire and reason to record it, these are disappearing. So we're not going to be able, I think, often to trace this level of overlap between money, status and power in the way we are here. And I think that's actually really concerning.
Ethan, can I ask you, I want to think a bit. So we've got this huge tranche of 3 million documents. That's obviously a very difficult sort of dump to handle in some ways. And I think, as I said, that there's lots of stuff, I think, yet to really be dug out of them. And I think in the longer term, what's clearly going to happen is this is going to become a database that people return to, much like the Panama Papers database, right? That over time you return to, and as things develop in the world, you go back and look and say, oh, okay, here's this connection or that connection. But I wonder if we can say already, how networks of influence like those cultivated by Epstein, and to a lesser scale, in fact, in Britain, cultivated through and by Peter Mandelson, work? Have we learned something new about how they work from this tranche, or does it confirm things that we already knew?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a bit of both going on there. I mean, when you look at what we've learned from this tranche and from the kind of what we know of the broader Epstein case as it relates to, I suppose, the kind of the business aspect of it, and because I think it has been noted that there are kind of separate circles, perhaps, and they certainly overlap. But I think we're mostly concerned in this conversation with I suppose kind of power and business and money, right? But I think when you look at this, it's clear that what you actually have here is a kind of informal and personal network, which is built around people who all exist at a certain strata within society and within the economy, and are part of this network by virtue of the fact that they can offer, in turn, their contacts. And when we talk about kind of high-powered lawyers, it's easy to see why bringing in someone who kind of has that level of kind of power to threaten journalists and to shut down negative stories, why they are then kind of quite comfortably accommodated into this club. So I think what we are seeing is a model that in this instance is, I think, personal and kind of relatively informal. It's been kind of cultivated by this individual who happens to sit at a very influential position at the kind of heights of finance. But actually, I think there is, and this is probably something that we will start to understand a bit more as we really look at this, and hopefully the aftermath of all this is a wider look at some of the industries and things that take on this. But I actually think there's a case we made that the way Epstein went about this task has kind of been taken up in more formalized ways over the last decade or so in particular, as kind of financialization has accelerated and private capital has come to play like a greater role. I think we see that there's a particular sector, like the kind of corporate advisory sector, which I think is dressed up in a lot of kind of corporate jargon and kind of obfuscatory language, but ultimately it functions in a very similar way to what we see. It is an industry that largely hires directly from the most senior ranks of government, from the civil service and from elected politicians. And it brings these people into an industry which essentially makes its money trading in very, very hard to acquire information. And we have no sight, we have no kind of way to understand, unless it comes out through a tranche of documents related to the world's most notorious paedophile. We have no way of understanding what goes on in this industry. But it's hard to imagine that when a kind of huge corporation pays six figures and more for a single report on any given regulatory issue to inform their stance going forward, that information is just going to be the kind of thing that you or I could glean from a good Google search. It kind of, I think the assumption has to be that the information that is passed around in this industry is, if not quite as egregious in some of the cases that we've seen in this, then is certainly as important and kind of as useful to this class that has exclusive access essentially to these networks.
Peter, what do you make of that? I mean, I suppose one way of reading, the danger here, I suppose in one sense, is you see this network of extremely wealthy, influential and powerful people trading secrets and influence with each other quite outside the confines of democracy, quite outside any possible scrutiny, whether by press or whether by democratic bodies. And in the case of Mandelson in particular, this is someone who is nominally a public servant, completely suborning their democracy by their access and effectively selling it to the highest bidder. Isn't it very tempting to start thinking like a conspiracy theorist about all this? To say, well, this is a conspiracy of powerful and influential people to maintain their power and influence. So I guess the question is, where's the dividing line between sort of a proper accounting of this and conspiracy theory?
I think so. To pull the lens back a little bit, like I would agree, like there's strong echoes of Pizzagate in this. If people remember the kind of QAnon idea that there was a paedophile ring operating in the basement of a Washington DC pizzeria that was been run by Hillary Clinton and her acolytes, and a man went in there with a gun and found there was actually no basement. So that was part of the problem at the Pizzagate story. But I see this. I think what's interesting is, I think conspiracies often, and this is where the difference is, conspiracies have a kind of a teleological kind of aspect to them. They are drawn to a point and to deliver a certain outcome. This, I don't think, what we are seeing here is not drawn to deliver a specific outcome. It isn't like this thing happens and this is the thing that caused it. This is, I think what you're seeing here is real networks of influence at play. So you're seeing the transformation of two things happening. The transformation of and capture of politics by money, by big money. So that's one of the things you're seeing here. And the other thing you're seeing is the rise of big money itself. We've seen like the people who are involved here, many of these places are super rich individuals. These are kind of individuals who own their own islands, who in the case of Elon Musk own their own social media platforms. This is, in many ways, it's a step change from the kind of captains of industry we would have seen in the post-war years. So these two things are happening at the same time. I talk a little bit about this kind of oligarch politician and the oligarch political class and this kind of things. This is what, in some ways, this is a bird's eye view into that. And what's also striking is, throughout these emails, many of these emails post-date Jeffrey Epstein's conviction on soliciting sex from a minor. Often this is referred to obliquely and only in kind of almost jokey terms, including by Mandelson. Mandelson's line has often been, well, I wasn't involved in any of this. I'm a gay man, so I had no interest in this. He might have I'm not suggesting for a second he was involved in abusing children anyway, but he seems to have no real care about the fact that Epstein was involved in that. So I think that's also something that's quite important within this, is a kind of, you get a look into a series of people who are used to acting with impunity, and which the kind of the moral codes of a society at a given moment start to disappear. And I think it's incredibly dangerous for democracy, especially in this current moment. I think this is really, I can't think of a more democratically damaging story, especially in the context of the global rise of the radical right, where people are saying to you, the system is broken, it is rigged, it's rigged for an elite. It's kind of a certain version of a conspiracy theory. And this does open a kind of a vault that you stare into and go, actually, there's a lot of that analysis which is not incorrect, which is real. And I guess that's where I would come back to, again, this difference, where it's less about delivering this one specific outcome or this one specific situation. It's all the time maximizing your advantage, whether that's professional, whether that's social, whether that's financial, and that's what I think comes out from all of this.
Yeah, I mean, what it seems to me is it's this is a startling insight into the private life of power. I think it's striking in the correspondence how little interest there actually is in politics, save as a field where you exert influence. There's actually really very little. Democracy is effectively, if it's there at all, it's there as a sort of sham, a thing to be influenced in one way or another. And I would just highlight the word that you used there, which is impunity. And I think that's, for me, is the key to a lot of this, right? Like, it's the thing that links the sort of sadistic pleasure in, trafficking in underage girls, in the coercion and abuse of women and girls, the sort of total the ability to act financially and politically without any consequence. Those things are all linked by that sense that there is no power greater than me that can cause or constrain and cause me to be constrained in any way. In some sense, the great irony is that Mandelson actually doesn't play on that level. Mandelson actually isn't powerful enough to suffer no consequences. I mean, as we see now, but some of the sliminess and some of the creepiness and some of the tonally squalid emails are about sort of mimicking that sort of behavior, the sort of off-color sexual jokes and that sort of thing, the total disregard for any other human being. And it's very hard as someone who tries to approach politics in a pragmatic and realistic or realist way to think, well, actually, some of those old conversations about political virtue are probably something that we need to bring back, actually.
I think there's something in it. I do. I think I found myself thinking that there's a kind of Matthew Oakeshott aspect to all of this, in terms of the great almost the kind of scholar, you could call him, of conservatism, and this idea of and even dare I say it, someone like Roger Scruton. There is something around virtue, and there's an interesting interview actually with Peter O'Born on the Second Captains and Irish podcast last week, where he was talking about Alistair McIntyre and his work on virtue. And I think there's something in there. I think there's something that, without getting too sepia tinged about it, and I'm always wary of that in my work. Like, we had scandals in the past. Mohammed Al Fayed was passing money into MPs' hands many years ago, but this does seem like it takes it to another level. And the idea, what's missing as well, I think you're totally right about the private life of power, the lack of politics. You know what's also missing completely? The lack of any idea of public service. Any idea that this is a public service role, that you're a part of what you're trying to do here is to help, is to be, you're giving of yourself. And what strikes you coming out from all of this, I mean, I'm sure we'll move into a little bit of this conversation too, is that Mandelson is clearly setting up his future. He's clearly paving the way for this future. And it feels like that's happening all the time. And it's something that I and Ethan both write about all the time, this idea of a revolving door between politics and business. That you leave office and you go, and we see this, and people who are still in office, but say still hold an MP seat, and when they stop being a minister or something. We saw this during the Conservatives. We'll see it again with Labour. Get it, £250,000 a year as a consultancy, for 2 days a month or something. And Mandelson is doing that, but kind of massively souped up version, but he is paving the way, and you can see it, which begs a much bigger question actually, which I've not heard asked at all, which is quite existential. If people in power are making decisions at a given moment, but also have an expectation of receiving rewards down the line, from a very narrow field of interest, from a very narrow section, the trade union Congress isn't going to pay you £250,000 for 2 days a month. It's only a narrow section of interest that are going to pay you that. How and to what extent does that warp and change the decisions that they make in the moment of governing?
I think that's really, really essential. It for me, I think there's, there are really serious questions to be asked about the way we regulate that transition between, the world of private business of various kinds, and particularly the world of lobbying and politics itself. Someone, many years ago, during I think it was in a period in which the people around Jeremy Corbyn were writing a manifesto. I can't remember which manifesto it was. It may have been 2017. And someone asked me, what would be the policy your dream policy. I said, look, there are many of them, but one of the things that I would do, and it's a quite idiosyncratic one, is give Akaba some teeth. So that's the body that basically rubber stamps people's exit from politics into private business. And I said, look, what I would do is stuff it full, make it a separate, powerful body, stuff it full of people who are actual regulators, who see their job as not to say yes to things, but see their job as to say, is this in public interest that you leave politics and take this job? And if it's not, then you say no. And if they flout your regulation, then you put them in prison. That seems to me to be the only way to do it. So it's again one of those sort of technical policy dreams. Ethan, I want to come to you on this question because in one sense, of course, Mandelson represents exactly that disposition, the belief in the sort of strong link between sort of lobbyists and all these kind of various corporate interests of various kinds and their interface with government. And I wonder if you can say a little about what you see as that ideology, what you see as that as the sort of key features of this orientation, which seems to me to be completely, it has completely rotted through the heart of the Labour Party at this point.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think it's difficult to try and to try and kind of formulate what this thing is, because it's almost defined by a lack of clear ideology. It's almost defined, I think, by I think a willingness to kind of, I think in their own words, is to kind of do what works. That was the kind of the mantra of Mandelson and his kind of ilk through that time. And it's I think that to use that frame almost gives them too much credit. I think, to go back to something that Peter was saying there, I think there's an element of almost kind of class consciousness that comes into play for these people that exist and know themselves to be a part of a political class which finds its only kind of viable life after politics in the corporate class. And I think we can understand most of these kind of activities as a kind of class solidarity of and an awareness that is now the class that they belong to. And so I think, but when we think of kind of, I suppose, people say, Mandelsonism or the kind of like Mandelsonian thing, I think that we see how it's influenced this version of Labour. Because to some extent it comes about in the first instance often through defining itself against the left and setting itself up to make sure that the left can't have power, rather than a desire to have power to do something particular with. It is all about this kind of starting point of, well, the left cannot have power, and in some ways its values come from that. The left hates big business, therefore we should obviously cozy up to big business. I think that's an important part of this to understand, is that, and as you said in these emails, we see no politics. There are no values being discussed. There are no ideological questions, and partly I think because the ideology is all completely unspoken. It's the ideology of power and of money, and how do I best serve myself? And if you operate as part of a class where everyone is thinking about how best to serve themselves within a certain framework, i.e. kind of like financialized capital, then actually that's quite coherent. If everyone is moving in that same direction for their own interest reasons, you are still getting a kind of a mass movement in one direction. So there is a coherency to it, but it kind of comes about after the fact, I suppose. But I think if we're talking about, I suppose, how it's visible in this version of the Labour Party, to the extent that has been influenced by Mandelson, I think it's possible to overstate that. But clearly he has been an influential advisor throughout this whole period. I think when we think about selections and the makeup of the PLP currently, are all of the new intake exactly kind of cast in Mandelson image? I don't think so. You see people from the soft left and from Blue Labour, which, despite its flaws, is quite set against that tradition. But I think what we do see, and this is something that Pete and I have written about quite extensively, I think, is this very significant number of people that are drawn from this world of lobbying and management consultancy and these related kind of sectors. And if that is the kind of political training ground for a group of people that move into politics, into the Labour Party, we have to think about what that means for who they are and how they kind of conceptualize politics. You have to be ideologically unmoored to some extent. You have to be able to sell a given policy by shaping a message around it to suit whatever audience it happens to be at that moment, rather than thinking about the needs of your constituency or the class that you're there to represent. And from that point, if we compare this to, I suppose, like the classic and slightly idealized traditional route into politics for a Labour MP through the trade unions, we see that, an emphasis on class politics and collectivism and ultimately kind of at its best, this like Labour laser focus on the interests of the working class above all else. Like, we can start to see if that's what's being shifted away from and toward this kind of lobbying professional political class. We start to see what's being lost here. And I think that is a kind of a Mandelsonian kind of tradition that is being taken up.
The LRB podcast wouldn't exist without the London Review of Books, Europe's leading magazine of culture and ideas. With a subscription, you not only get the latest issue of the paper, you also get access to everything we've published over more than 40 years in our online archive. So if you enjoy the podcast, why not try 6 months of the magazine for just £12? Go to lrb.me/pod and we'll also send you a free LRB tote bag. That's lrb.me/pod, or find the link in the description.
And, I think prior to this government taking power, or just after the election, I think many of us looked at the composition of particularly the new intake of MPs and said, look, there's going to be, at some point in this parliament, there's going to be a big lobbying scandal, because you don't get that many lobbyists in a room without at least one scandal between them. That's got to happen there somewhere. I mean, I don't think it's come out yet. I mean, save the stuff that's happening now, which I think is, obviously in some sense is bigger than that. It's maybe worth saying, lots of people assume that lobbying is a regulated activity in this country, and in a sense, there is a register of parliamentary lobbyists, and if you go through it, it's really amazingly empty. And this is a piece of sort of astonishing Cameron-era regulation in which the criteria you have to meet to be registered as a parliamentary lobbyist are so kind of tight and so easy to evade that I think, if you lobby, if there are various reasons that you can conjure up a meeting that therefore doesn't have to be registered as lobbying. There are various forms of approach. There are various, and so on and so on and so on. And it has always struck me. It has always struck me as a kind of astonishing example of regulatory capture, and because it's so flagrant, it's one of the things that you say, okay, well, this is a model for exactly how, if someone holds these interests and is easily swayed by them, that they can produce a piece of regulation that purports to regulate a field without effectively doing it anyway. And that seems to me to be a story that is repeated across quite a lot of British politics. And let's talk about a case in point here, which is, as we've alluded to in this conversation, Global Counsel, which is the firm that Mandelson set up and used to head up, still maintains a large shareholding in. That shareholding, when he went back into politics, was put into a blind trust. We can talk about whether that's an adequate way of safeguarding against sort of corrupt decision making. But Peter, what does Global Counsel do?
Global Counsel, like a lot of these kind of firms, would probably describe itself as an advisory firm, which kind of covers a multitude of sins or covers a multitude of activities. You're talking about everything from providing analysis and research to providing what you might call government relations, so getting you in front of government ministers and things like that. It would also do things like provide briefings and all, so it would do what we'd also call public affairs. So it might do various different public affairs work. So some of it might be to do with government, and some of it might be actually kind of public facing as well, and even B2B stuff as well. So Global Counsel does all that. And what's fascinating about Global Counsel is a bunch of fascinating things. And the FT, I think the FT's reporting in general on Epstein's story has been very strong, partly because I think they were across all this early. I lost about 2 days of my week last week looking into the Global Counsel aspects of these emails, and the FT obviously scooped the hell out of me on that because they were all over it. But what was fascinating, what really struck me going through the Epstein files was that Global Counsel was created just as after Peter Mandelson left office, so not long afterwards. Set up with him and a guy called Ben Wegg-Prosser, who also used to be Tony Blair's number 10. Still exists, has lots of clients, doesn't declare his clients publicly, so you only see which ones they put on this Oracle register. So it's only the ones that clients that they are having an engagement with a government minister or senior civil servant on a specific issue. That's the window that they have to fit in to declare their clients. So Global Council is formed shortly after Mandelson leaves office. What's striking in the Epstein emails is you get a real depth for the very first time of how across the formation of Global Council Epstein actually was. And that's what the FT reported. Their reporting actually cost Ben Weg-Prosser his job. He resigned last week on the back of it. And you really see it. And in it, I was going through all these emails. It's like, at one stage, Mandelson is talking about meeting a man who he's met in New York, a Ghanaian politician who he thinks could be a really good guy. This man is now serving 7 years in prison at the moment in the US due to money laundering. Oleg Deripaska is in there, the Russian oligarch who actually Mandelson had when he actually been brought back into government in 2008 by Gordon Brown. Mandelson, people might remember the famous picture of Mandelson on a yacht. I know there's a lot of them, but this one was with Oleg Deripaska, who's now a sanctioned Russian oligarch. He was an early client of Global Council too. We get to see some of these clients on the list as well because they don't declare them. That's really interesting. But the really striking thing is you can see at one stage, I think 2013, Mandelson emails Epstein a big kind of like, this is where Global Council is. And including, he says, I don't want just advisory fees, I need capital now. And you can see, as the conversation we had earlier, what he's doing there effectively is setting the ground for him to go on and try and cash in his chips effectively. And that's what I think it's almost impossible, knowing what we know now, to not say that Global Council was a vehicle for Peter Mandelson to try and realise financially his political connections. I've spoken to people who worked in Global Council. It's quite interesting. As an organisation, often these advisory firms can be quite chaotic, actually, surprisingly, internally. Global Council was one in which the top brass had a lot of control. The Tony Blair Institute actually is very similar, even though it's not an advisory. I've written about them a lot too, but the very small number of people in and around Peter Mandelson knew all the clients, knew all the outworkings, and the lower down the food chain, it was quite chaotic, and a lot of people had not got full exposure of what the organisation was doing. But strikingly, and this is where it brings it into the contemporary world, a lot has now been made, unsurprisingly, that one of Global Council's clients was Palantir. Peter Thiel, the Trump donor, Palantir, at this stage I think it's fair to say notorious, given how important they are for ICE and the work that ICE does in the United States, as we're seeing in Minneapolis right now. And fascinatingly now, what's becoming a bit of a scandal, just this morning as we was recording, I've just had a message actually that James Cartledge, who I think is the Shadow Defence Secretary, is going to give ask an urgent question about the government's relationship with Palantir. This is long running. We've signed a lot of contracts. The Tories signed a lot of contracts with Palantir. But on the back of these emails, on the back of the Epstein and Mandelson, Palantir is now becoming, and the government's reliance on Palantir is becoming a story. We actually broke a story on Democracy for Sale last year, looking at some of these NHS contracts. The interesting thing was actually you'll often find is people aren't happy with them. They don't work. We had all these hospitals who weren't using them because they didn't like it and they said it doesn't work. But what's the nub of all this? You get someone like Palantir. So then when Peter Mandelson becomes the UK ambassador, what happens? Keir Starmer goes to DC to meet with Trump, big flagship moment. Where does he go afterwards? He goes to Palantir's offices with Peter Mandelson. And that absolutely encapsulates this huge conflict of interest. You have a man, Peter Mandelson, who's given the job of UK ambassador, despite all we know about him, who still has shares in his own consultancy company, Global Council. He has not divested them in them. He's then bringing his boss, the Prime Minister, to a private company who his advisory firm, Global Council, also advises. This was running through it. This was not new. This was not known. When this meeting took place, when Mandelson brought Starmer there, many journalists like me and Eaton and others were standing up and pointing at this, going, this is a problem. But I think it's fair to say a lot of the political class, and I do include colleagues in the media in this, did not seem to see this as anything really untoward. And I think that does kind of, there's an ingrained sense that this is just how business is done.
That's right, isn't it, Ethan? There's a sort of realism or sort of pseudo-realism that characterises most of the responses to this stuff in the press.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was listening to you there, Peter, I think I always think that perhaps I'm perhaps more ideological than some kind of media colleagues, but I think the problem is that this is an entirely legitimized industry that actually has no there is no feeling out in the real world, so to speak, that this should be legitimate. It is only seen as legitimate to people that are part of this world to varying extents. If you ask the man on the street whether any of this should in any way be allowed, they will almost always say no to no extent. So there's these various degrees of kind of legitimization that you see here, and I think the point that Peter's making there is that it's easy once the kind of lurid emails come out in this specific context to highlight Palantir and to then draw the line and say, well, Palantir was a client of Global Counsel, which is Peter Mandelson's firm, and because we know that Peter Mandelson and Epstein were involved in this horrible lurid thing, now that connection is somehow problematic. When before it was understood, that connection was well understood, and we see the mirror of it in what happened when Palantir signed off its first contracts with the government under the Conservatives. The two lobbying firms that Palantir has used throughout its history of kind of seeking influence and seeking contracts from the UK government are Global Counsel, which, as we've discussed, is founded by Peter Mandelson, who has his connections to the Labour Party, and Fleetwood Strategy, which is co-founded by Isaac Levido, who is a kind of protege of Lyndon Crosby, who has very, very, very close connections to, the global right, but certainly the Conservative Party in the UK. It's the same model, and for however many years that was just understood to be part and parcel of how this kind of thing works. So, sometimes I struggle when we talk about, I suppose, the regulatory framework for lobbying and stuff, because I think you're absolutely right that if we could find some kind of actual body with some teeth that could police these issues, and that's a different thing. I sometimes worry when we talk too much about transparency, and when that is a kind of panacea that as long as we can see everything, then everything is going to be fine. Well, it doesn't deal with the actual question of whether any of this should be legitimate in the first place. And I mean, unfortunately, I've never had the pleasure of working under you, Peter, but I've worked under a lot of editors who, when you bring them stories about lobbying or related things, will say, yeah, but where's the rule breaking? Where's the smoking gun? And the point is often not, I think this shows us how very rare it is to see a smoking gun. That's how this industry operates, is that so much of it is able to go on outside of our view, that the opportunities to actually see the smoking gun, or for it to break a law when those laws are so kind of flawed, are so limited. I think we have to broaden out the conversation at some point to whether there is actually any merit to the vast majority of the industry that we describe as lobbying, which, let's not forget, it ranges from, I don't know, the RSPB having MPs pose next to a picture of an endangered bird and then tweet about it. Sorry, that's but it ranges from that to the kind of thing we're talking about. Should we have language that reflects the vast difference in how anti-democratic those two things are? I think we probably should. So I think there's a lot. It's very difficult to unpick that, I think, because we are left only really with the language that's afforded by these companies to describe what they do. Advisory firm sounds perfectly legitimate, right? Sounds kind of like, yeah, that's fine. But were we to actually understand what makes up a large portion of that work, would we see it in the same way? I think those are some of the problems that we have here, and I don't profess to have all perhaps any of the answers to this, but I do think we have to think more deeply about whether so much of what is going on outside of these isolated incidents should actually be allowed to continue in the form it is. And I think most people would feel that no, it's not, because it comes back to what Peter was talking about. So many incentives are put in place throughout a political career to leave yourself, when you leave government or leave the civil service, in a position that allows you to enter this world without any problem. I wanted to just highlight one of the things that came out through these files, which is a recording of a conversation that Epstein had with the former Israeli Prime Minister, whose name I forget.
Ehud Barak.
Yes, sorry, yeah. So he essentially gives the kind of blueprint for how you set one of these advisory firms up, and he says to him essentially, make a list of all the people who, from your political career, owe you a favor or two, and from that list, draw your first clients and stuff. We can overcomplicate this a little bit, but I think that makes it quite clear and quite plain what a large portion of this whole industry is built on, to my view.
I think that's entirely right. I have a long-running argument with an Italian friend about whose country is more corrupt, and he says, quite rightly, look at this kind of the vast range of corruption here in Italy. And I said, well, at least you prosecute people for it. I mean, in Britain, it's legal I mean, we do it legally. We have a register of people who say, you know, well, because I've told you that I've taken this money or these tickets or whatever, then I can't possibly be accused of any conflict of interest. Or, I mean, nominally we don't elevate people to the House of Lords as a piece of political patronage, but of course, donors are elevated to the House of Lords on the back of their donations. And of course, the thing that we should stress about that is elevating someone to the House of Lords is a means of allowing them to profit from that position. And it's one of the points that sort of Jack Straw made when he was caught lobbying for various clients prior to what he expected to be his elevation to the House of Lords. He said, well, the rules are a lot broader there. I can get away with all sorts of things. That's the point. The point is allowing them to become a lord so they can sit on various boards and so on and so on and so on. Let's talk about these people a bit. I think it's worth mentioning one of those moments where politics really does arise in these files, which is an email sent by Epstein to Peter Thiel of Palantir around Brexit. It's an email thread with lots of other people, and he says, this is a moment. He says this is the beginning. This is the beginning of effectively a global change, increased tribalism. Lots of sort of distressed assets for us to snap up. Again, this is one of those moments where you think, I find myself reaching for my sort of more conspiratorial reasoning here. But as we've said, this is simply the way in which these people think about power and global events. And I wonder if Peter, if you have something to say about that particular cluster of Epstein correspondence and Epstein network. So it encapsulates Palantir, which is this huge kind of tech surveillance state provision company, along with Bannon, who's this kind of a huge figure on the new right, new political right globally. There's a cluster of interest here around technology, around the authoritarian state, also around eugenics and sort of longevity and biohacking and weird sort of genetic racism of various kinds. How should we think about that weird little cluster?
I think Quint Slobodian's recent book, High Ex Bastards, is actually quite a useful place to start. In some respects, in some ways it looks strange and surreal and what's going on here, but actually there's a lineage to this thinking that I think dates back onto the new right from the kind of the end of the Cold War, effectively, where very soon after the Cold War, the Murray Rothbards of this world, the kind of the Montpellier societies of this world, when actually the real enemy is the globalists and climate and all the rest, but also moved into this both conspiratorial way of thinking and very racialized. I think that's what comes out of High Ex Bastards very strongly. It's a very racialized view of the world, and the bell curve and all the rest of it kind of hove into view. So in some ways, this is again illuminating something that we can see around us. So we can see the strange globalization of the National Conservative movement, where they wander from Budapest in Hungary to Washington DC to London to all over the place, funded by huge money, big tech money, and all the rest of it, while spouting a very, very kind of national conservative language. So you can see a lot of those threads already there, but it is fascinating to see them because it brings you back to that point about politics. So Epstein seems like an empty vessel when it comes to politics. Actually, there's no political conversation. So when Thiel starts and Thiel, if anyone read the op-ed he wrote in the FT just after the US election in what would have been, I think, probably November of 2024, this, talking about quite like a very conspiratorial, deeply conspiratorial view of the world, and that says that was conspiratorial, like JFK assassination, etc., etc. You can see this, and it's also underlaid with disaster capitalism, and so you've got all of these things at play. And I also I've been finding myself getting a bit lost in the world of Larry Ellison of late. She's one of the tech oligarchs, the big tech, kind of almost the original tech oligarch, the founder of Oracle, second richest man in the world, is now in his 80s. What runs through a lot of these people is this longevity play, this play around the body, this play around kind of a fear of Thanatos, a kind of a deep belief in creating a curated health products that just exist for the super rich. So these are all coming together within this. And I think, in some ways, what's fascinating about it is to see these conversations were happening so long ago. because they didn't really come to fruition, I think, until the last couple of years. They were in the background as noise during Trump 1, whereas in Trump 2, in the era of Project 2025 of the Heritage Foundation, the kind of quiet parts are now being said out loud. Libertarians are buying islands and saying kits and creating their own legal systems within them. Like this kind of, and it goes back again to what you see in this takeover politics, this capture politics by the super rich. And these are people, someone like Thiel and others, these are people for whom there is no political accountability. Absolutely none. You fund politics, you fund people like Donald Trump, and then they become vessels for you to do what you want to it. And this is the other side of this. We see more and more that the kind of, unsurprisingly, the oligarch political class that are emerging, their wealth and their power, they have a lot of power as frontmen, as populist frontmen, but they also are massively in hock to these great powers, especially the great powers who've got technology, like Thiel, people who've got technology and are seen then as been able to use that technology. So whether it's Elon Musk on Twitter or Mark Zuckerberg, but also people like Bezos and Thiel also have this sense in which, in the AI play, Sam Altman, all of that stuff is all rolling in together. And, we can see this actually from a lot of the public statements of these people, but it's fascinating, I think, to kind of get that bird's eye view. What I'd love to know is, what does those conversations look like now? What's Mark Andreessen saying on private WhatsApp stations right now?
Ethan, I want to bring you in because I started this conversation talking about consequences, and of course Peter Mandelson has faced some consequences. There's a police investigation live into misconduct in public office. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding of that offence is that they would have to demonstrate intention. It's quite a tightly drawn offence, and it would be quite difficult to demonstrate the intention for misconduct. But who knows? There might be something that happens there. Political consequences. Morgan McSweeney's job is gone. Keir Starmer looks imperiled. Now, Keir Starmer, failure of judgment, not actually in the Epstein files, not actually directly involved in this stuff. Certainly some errors here. So my question in one sense is about political consequences on that scale. And I wonder whether you have a thought also on the political consequences more widely, because my fear, and this fear emerges from conversations with people in my life who are not politics people, right? So people who don't follow politics very closely and don't follow political news very closely have a sense that this stuff is going on. And they have a sort of increasingly black-pilled relationship to these stories, right? Where they find themselves in that it confirms their worst fears or intuitions about the political class. It feeds a deep sense of sort of legitimacy crisis, right? That nobody in politics is legitimate, or nobody in politics means what they say, and that really there's no point in expecting to pursue any of these people, either for redress or even that even through the vehicle of political participation at the ballot box, because it will make no difference anyway. Are they right?
Perhaps I've spent too long digging through this set of files to form the kind of optimistic answer that you might be looking for there. No, I think that clearly, if we think about the first part of that question and the kind of political consequences for Keir Starmer and this project, look, Keir Starmer as an individual clearly isn't. I think it's fair to say that isn't of that world. But his kind of colossal misjudgment and failure was to effectively kind of contract out a lot of the politics, certainly the internal politics of his leadership and his campaign, and later his government, to a group of people who in Mandelson's case are directly of that world, but certainly represent this kind of world in the sense of like the kind of corporate class and big business. And that's a failure that I think he deserves, alongside other failures, that he deserves to suffer the consequences that I believe are coming, which I don't think that his government will be able to limp on much past the local elections if it reaches that far. And I think Peter Mandelson will become a cautionary tale for kind of young members of Labour First or whichever other kind of factional group. Although I wonder whether the moral of that story will be don't kind of subvert democracy in the interest of the powerful, or whether it'll be delete your emails, which will be the lesson there. But I think more broadly, perhaps we have to try and look for versions of politics that are staunchly set against this kind of close relationship with business. I mean, Peter and I have been saying this among others, but not many, I don't think, that Starmer's Labour is uniquely enmeshed with the kind of corporate lobbying world. It is structured in such a way that it is hardwired from before it came to power, and certainly since. It is hardwired kind of business engagement, to use another one of these kind of like slightly airy, jargony words, into its policymaking processes. It brings business around the table when it sets up policy on any number of areas, but particularly in those areas where, whether it's financial regulation, whether it's on mergers and acquisitions, these kind of things that are slightly outside the interest of the average kind of voter, and has essentially handed them over to have business kind of shape that agenda. So I suppose the answer is that it's hard not to conclude, looking at this and then understanding how this whole industry works and how corporate power will inevitably reshape itself to influence and to capture whichever political project from a certain tradition comes to power. I don't think there's anyone would suggest that Reform are going to somehow kind of disavow this whole approach to politics if they form a government. I guess the danger is, James, as you say, if you are kind of sufficiently black-pilled, then at least you kind of go for the political project that isn't trying to sell you the kind of the lie of being entirely motivated by the best interests of the public. Maybe that's the danger there. But I think there are and there have been political projects in currently and in the last 10 years that would have taken a conscious stance against this exact kind of relationship with big business. They have been defeated, unfortunately. I suppose we can only hope that the next iterations aren't. But yeah, that's as close as optimism as I can get, I'm afraid.
Peter.
I think something similar. I think it's quite like, I think it's hard in the current climate. So if I was to look, the optimistic bit of me is like, so to take a kind of more legislative approach, like what are the mechanisms that might change this? I think that is the kind of is quite a useful place to start with some of these things. Like there is a toolkit, without getting too technocratic on it, like you mentioned about Aqaba, which actually no longer exists. Aqaba was done away with a couple of months ago, and this is a useful cautionary tale. It's supposed to be replaced by this Ethics and Integrity Commission, which we really have heard very little about. And I think it's one of the striking things is that Labour promised quite a lot of things in this space in their manifesto. Not super concrete, but quite a lot. Talked a good game about taking money out of politics, and so far done nothing. The bush with this is there's an elections bill coming. It was due to land this week as we speak. Actually, it was due to land on Thursday. I think it's 50-50 whether it does or not, but it will come soon. There is an opportunity to do some stuff in and around that. There's the opportunity to like take some of the big money out of British politics. We allow unlimited political donations in the UK. That's very unusual. Even America doesn't do that. The reason you have huge money in America is because of the First Amendment and Citizens United in the Supreme Court. So there's lots of other countries don't do that. So you could start to take some of this money out of politics. As part of this, you could do lobbying reform. We've seen none. I remember when the Greensill scandal broke, I wrote a piece for the paper, and I was very optimistic in that. I think I wrote at the end of the piece that, finally something will be done. I was, reader, I was once bitten, twice shy on that, because David Cameron famously actually didn't have to qualify as a lobbyist because he was an in-house lobbyist. There was a series of investigations, all of which came up with loads of recommendations, and nothing was done. But there's legislative opportunities. You could bring in proper lobbying legislation. You could bring in proper teeth. You could give the Electoral Commission proper powers to investigate. You could give large fines. There is a toolkit that you could start to roll out. I don't think it would change every aspect of this culture. I don't think rules can do that alone. I don't think rules alone are going to change the reality, the dark reality in terms of the scale of capture that we have. And I think the scale of capture by tech is really big part of that. I think the rules part of that is really quite tricky to figure out what to do there. But there is signals that government could send. There is signals that they could send around how this operates. And it's striking, we know that, we actually know from Gabriel Pogran and Patrick Maguire's excellent book Get In, that there was before Labour came to power, they were going to make a big announcement, donations. Gordon Brown was going to come down from Scotland, and Wahid Ali, Lord Ali, the guy who famously gave lots of sunglasses and clothes to Keir Starmer, he nixed it, the big donor. And that is a recurring theme in this, is that donors have too much power. Donors are able to stop legislation that will affect their ability to give money. But that doesn't mean the government can't act. The government can't do something. We've just done a piece of work that's going to go out the next day or so, that looking at corporate donations. At the last general election, the Labour Party took more money from corporate donations than it did from trade unions. So like this is changing really quickly. Big money is becoming a big feature of it. There are things that could be done. So I think the culture piece of it is real. It's really hard to roll back on a lot of that. We're talking about decades, I think, now at this point of this huge swathe. But there is, government can govern a bit, and it feels at the moment that it's still doing this impotent thing where it's like throwing its hands up in the air and going, what can be done?
That, I think, is almost a note of potential hope on which to leave it. Governments can actually govern, from your lips to Number 10's ears, if only. This has been, I think, an excellent and clarifying tour through some very dark material and some very worrying materials. So, Peter and Ethan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having us, James.
Thank you. Yeah, been great.